Hey everybody, Dr. Phil here. This is going to be a video on summarizing data with pivot tables. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So let's first talk about using some of the lookup functions. So we're able to create in Excel what we call approximate match lookups. So as the name suggests, it's not going to be exactly that, but it's going to be sort of approximately close to it. So an approximate match lookup is a lookup in which the lookup value is compared to ranges of values, right, rather than a single specific value. The approximate match lookups can reference a vertical or horizontal lookup table. Excel finds an approximate match by going down the first column of the table until it locates the row containing the largest value that is less than or equal to the lookup value. Then it retrieves the corresponding values from that row. So creating approximate, let's continued. The exact match lookup occurs when the lookup value must match one of the values in the first column or the row of the lookup table. An approximate match lookup occurs when the lookup value is found within a range of numbers in the first column or row of the lookup table. So here we can see an example, right? So we have the date of the media post, we've got the link, the URL link to the post, social media site, number of subscribers, the media post topic, and then the total views, likes, comments, and shares that are given to the media post. So obviously this has taken a bit of a marketing bent. The Excel family of logical functions is used to set data values based on whether a condition is true or false. We can use what we call the ifs or IFS function. So the IFS function tests for multiple conditions without nesting and has the syntax if, and then we're just basically opening parentheses, logical test one, comma, value if true, and then so on and so forth. We can also combine conditions with the OR and functions. So the OR function combines multiple conditions, returning a value of true if any of the conditions are true. The AND function returns a value of true if all of the conditions are true. And the two functions, as you notice below, they have a very similar syntax. So as an example, right, see if you can see at the top here what I typed in. So we have the formula up here for the profit group field in this example, and then the profit group for each media post. We can use the count if, the sum if, and the average if functions to calculate a conditional count, sum, or average using only cells that meet a particular condition. Conditional counting with COUNTIF calculates the number of cells in a range that match specified criteria, sometimes referred to as a conditional count. And then with the syntax, it would just, of course, just be COUNTIF, open parentheses, range, comma, criteria, just like before, and then close parentheses. So here you can see an example. So we have the COUNTIF for media, and it's counting the total posts made to Facebook. We've got the COUNTIF counting the total posts made to Instagram, and then of course so on and so forth. Now every pivot table includes the following four primary areas. So the rows area, which displays category values from one or more fields arranged in separate rows, and also the columns area, which displays categories from one or more fields arranged in separate columns. The values area displays summary statistics for one or more fields at each intersection of each row and column category. And then, of course, the filters area, last but not least. And the filters area contains a filter button that limits the pivot table to only those values matching specified criteria. Now we can insert a pivot table. So the first thing we would do is we would want to create a pivot table. So you would just click in the data range or an Excel table, and then click the pivot table button. It's going to be in the tables group at the top on the insert tab. This reserves a space 3 columns wide by 18 rows tall, well, kind of by default. And that can be changed, by the way, for the initial pivot table report. If the worksheet does not have enough empty space, you'll be prompted to overwrite the cell contents. Now, the pivot table layout is created by dragging fields from the field list into one of the four area boxes. This determines the basic structure of the pivot table. And it's worth noting there's no particular order that the areas of the table need to be filled in. I will say this, pivot tables are excellent for data exploration because you can quickly change the pivot table layout to view your data from many different angles, which is very, very handy, very useful. To change the content of the pivot table, drag fields out of any of the four area boxes to remove them from the table, and then just simply drop new fields into the area boxes to add them. That's all you have to do. Pivot tables are not limited to a single field in the rows or columns area. You can actually place additional fields in each area, nesting one field within another, which is pretty handy. The filters area is a quick way to filter pivot table data. When you add a field to the filters area, a filter button appears 2 rows above the upper left corner of the table. You can then use the button to choose a value to filter the entire pivot table by. So here's sort of an example for you. So the filters area provides a filter button to filter the entire pivot table. The pivot tables displays counts, sums, averages, and other statistical calculations of a value field. That's what you see in here. The rows area contains one or more fields containing categorical data, think of like different categories, laid out in separate rows. The values area displays summary statistics at each intersection of a row category and a column category. Pivot tables can include grand totals across all row and column categories. And then columns area contains one or more fields containing categorical data laid out in separate columns. You can format pivot tables to make them more visually appealing and the results easier to read. You should format a pivot table after you have decided on its structure, layout, and contents. So that's pretty important. Yeah, you're also able to change labels and number formats if you needed to, you could do that. By default, Excel uses the count function to summarize non-numeric data and the sum function for numeric data. However, sometimes you'll want to use different statistics in your analysis, and you can to some extent, you can customize those, what you want those statistics to be. Now, once you define the category order, that order becomes part of the pivot table cache, which stores information about the pivot table. If you move the engagement grade field to another area of the table, or remove it and add it back in later, Excel will remember your preferred category order, so you will not have to redefine it. So here we can see the sums are broken out by values, so the cite field at the top here, kind of what we were just talking about. Sums of the views, likes, comments, shares, and engagement fields are, of course, here. And then it displays summary stats in separate rows over here. And again, here is where you can sort of really get into some customization if you so desire. Now, just as you can apply built-in styles to Excel tables, there are built-in styles that you can apply pivot tables. These styles are available in a pivot table styles gallery, which includes a variety of column and row colors. Another design feature you might want to remove are the filter buttons from the pivot table's row and column areas. So here we can see the filter button removed from the column. Now the axis or category area displays categories that each data series is plotted against. The legend or series area breaks up the data values into separate data series. The values area contains the data values that are plotted on the pivot chart. And finally, the filter area contains a filter button that limits the pivot chart to only those values satisfying specified criteria. Now, if you wanted to create a pivot chart, it's either done from the existing pivot table, or you can create at the same time as its pivot table. The layout of a pivot table and pivot chart always mirror one another. That's important to kind of, bear in mind, if you will. Any changes you make to the structure and layout of a pivot table affect the pivot chart and vice versa. And not every Excel chart type can be created as a pivot chart. So that's also good to know. Now, moving a pivot chart to another worksheet, that does sometimes come up. The pivot table and pivot chart do not need to be on the same worksheet, although they have to be in the same, sort of file workbook, if you will. So here we can see the filters area provides a filter button to filter the entire pivot chart. The pivot chart displays counts, sums, averages, etc. The axis or categories area contains the fields representing categories that data values are plotted against. Here we can see the values area, which contains the data values plotted on the pivot chart. And then the legend or series area breaks up the data values into separate data series. So again, like I always say, like the old saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So this is much better presented like this than it probably would be, just as a bunch of numbers. All right, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you all in a future video. Take care.